Hello and welcome back to another video. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one I'll be continuing my analysis of the possibility of Russian offensive operations taking place from the northern section of the front line in the Kursk region and all the way down south to the Kherson region, where in the previous video I concluded that it is extremely unlikely that the Russians will launch any offensive operation in the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions, the remaining parts of this winter and at the start of spring. Instead, the focus will be in the Donetsk region, which will be the focus of this video. We take a look at the Donetsk region, we can see that the Russians have been advancing a lot in this direction since the start of their offensive in October of 2023. This month has been no exception, as we can see the Russians have advanced from the very northern outskirts of the Donetsk region near Terny towards Liman, and to the very southern outskirts of the region near Velika Novosilka to gain control of the town. At the same time, the Russians have been pushing west of Khodorkovy towards Avdiivka, northwest of Khodorkovy, in the western flank of Selidovo towards Dnipropetrovsk region, in the western flank of Pokrovsk towards Dnipropetrovsk region, and to gain control over the supply lines of the city to the east of Pokrovsk, as well as in the area between Donetsk and Pokrovsk, in the direction of Donetsk itself, gaining control over the remaining parts of the city, and near Chasiv Yar. All of these are separate actions that the Russians are launching in one coordinated large offensive to gain full control over the Donetsk region. Now, if we take a look at the arrows, we can see exactly where the main effort is concentrated for the Russian forces. We see that there is a large push taking place west of Donetsk city, where the Russians are attempting to reach the Dnipropetrovsk region and gain full control over the southwestern outskirts of the region. At the same time, we also see a large push in the direction of the west of Pokrovsk, which is one of the areas where we've seen the most advances by the Russians, and to the east of the city. These two areas, we see that the Russians are working on flanking the city itself rather than storming it directly. The objective of the Russians is to cut off the supply routes of the Ukrainian forces to gain control over those that will limit the supplies and thereby the strength and defensive capabilities of the Ukrainian armed forces within the city. It is therefore, I believe, obvious that the Donetsk region will be the main battlefield of this war for the rest of the winter and for the start of spring. What we will be seeing is that the Russians will, at the start of spring in March, have full control over the majority of the southwestern parts of the Donetsk region and will have reached the border area of the Dnipro region in the area from Pokrovsk all the way down south to Velika Novosilka. The town of Velika Novosilka will be fully under Russian control within the next few days. The Russians are also storming the town of Avdiivka in the north, gain control over the remaining parts near Khodorkovy. This will happen within the next week or two, where the Russians will gain full control over these areas, after which the battle towards the Dnipropetrovsk region will take place in the month of February, where the Russians will likely gain control over the entire area from Pokrovsk towards Velika Novosilka in the Donetsk region by the end of February. At the same time, the Russians will continue their operations west of Pokrovsk and east of Pokrovsk. The Russians will look to gain control over the remaining parts of the area around Donetsk all the way to the reservoir south of the city of Konstantinivka, where they'll look to encircle the Ukrainian forces in this large pocket that is being formed by a push from the Russians from the western and eastern directions. This will allow the Russians to align the front line in its entirety with the highway between Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk from the eastern and western directions. The move in the north of Avdiivka towards this pocket here is a very strategic one, as it means that the Russians will secure the northern flank of Avdiivka. Currently, what we see is that the area that is closest to the city of Donetsk is actually this area north of Avdiivka. And there's hardly any defensive capabilities of the Russians in the area other than pure manpower to defend this flank, which will allow the Ukrainians, in case they launch a counterattack, to reach Avdiivka and the city of Donetsk itself, which will significantly weaken the Russian offensive operations in the western direction. Therefore, if the Ukrainians will be launching a new offensive, and it isn't inside Russia, which I believe is the most likely direction, then this will be the direction. If the Russians gain control over these fortified positions north of Avdiivka, they'll have a much larger buffer zone between their positions in the city of Avdiivka and have a large buffer area with several fortified layers to defend from the northern flank, and this will diminish this threat in its entirety, and the city of Donetsk will be completely clear of any Ukrainian forces in any direction. Therefore, if we take into account these focuses of the Russian armed forces, we'll likely see that the Russians will gain control over the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region up towards the city of Pokrovsk. They'll likely gain control over the area up to the highway from the eastern direction through and connected to the city of Donetsk, and they'll look to gain control over the city of Chestov Yar, the remaining parts of it, to connect the front line with the city of Donetsk from that direction as well. This will begin two sieges simultaneously: the siege of the city of Pokrovsk and the siege of the city of Konstantinivka. What this will lead to is that the Russian forces will make use of three main areas. In the siege of Konstantinivka, there will be a push directly from the Bakhmut direction through Chasiv Yar towards Konstantinivka from the east, a push directly from Toretsk towards Konstantinivka from the south, and a push from the city of Donetsk itself from the southwest. This will attack the city of Konstantinivka from three different directions. In the direction of Pokrovsk will be the push directly from the city of Donetsk through Selidove from the southern direction, will be from Kurokove from the southwestern direction, and it will be from Novhorodivka in the southeastern direction. Where in both of these cases, the objective of the Russians will be to gain control over the high ground and the supply routes of the Ukrainians along both cities. The objective would be to isolate them as much as possible by gaining control over as many roads as possible, remaining only a single route in and out of these cities. It will be the highway from Konstantinivka through towards Kramatorsk and Sloviansk in the north, and the highway from Pokrovsk towards this city again from the north. The Russians will look to cut off all other roads in and out of these cities, whether it's from the eastern, southern, or western direction. And the objective of the Russians, I believe, will be to gain control over both of these cities before June, similar to the Battle of Bakhmut, which ended on the 20th of May, 2023. Therefore, by the 20th of May, 2025, we may see the Russian capture of Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka. But the objective here is to gain control of both of these cities and allow the Russians to start a push towards Droshkivka, Kramatorsk, and Sloviansk from the southern direction and from the western direction, where the Russians will look to gain control over the western parts of the Donetsk region, and the siege of Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, as well as Liman in the north, will take place over the remaining parts of the summer, and by the end of summer, the Russians will likely have full control over the entirety of the Donetsk region, as the situation will drastically change once the Russians gain control over Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka. Therefore, I believe we can conclude that the Russians are planning a three-step process, which is the winter process, the spring process, and the summer process. The winter process is to gain control over the remaining parts of Velika Novosilka all the way up to Pokrovsk in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region along the highway, as well as the area between the intersection and the city of Toretsk, as well as the area between the intersection and Myrnorad. Gain control over these areas around the city of Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka. At the same time, it will be to gain control of the remaining parts of Chasiv Yar and to connect the front line from Chasiv Yar to Toretsk to begin the siege of both Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk. The spring progress will be to gain control over both Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka, gaining control over the highway alongside them. This will significantly improve the positions of the Russians for further operations in the Donetsk region, in the western parts of it. And the summer process will be to push from the city of Pokrovsk towards Kramatorsk, from the city of Konstantinivka towards Kramatorsk, and then onwards towards Sloviansk. Taking a look at the northern section of the front line along the Uskil River line and the Serbets River line, drawing out the river lines of Uskil here in the north and the Serbets River line in the east, we see that there are three ongoing operations by the Russians. The Russian operation to capture Tverishna across the Uskil River line north of Kupiansk, the Russian operation to siege Borova from the northern direction west of the Serbets River line in the north, and the Russian operation to gain a bridgehead across the Serbets River line towards Liman in the south. These three operations are taking place simultaneously. We see that the Russians throughout this winter will likely look to gain full control over the Vorishna and start the siege of Kupiansk in the south, to advance further towards Borova, gaining control over the first line of defense, and to gain a strong foothold and bridgehead across the Serbets River line in the south. The spring progress process will be to gain full control over Kupiansk, gain full control over Borova, and to start the siege of Liman and potentially gain full control over that city as well, gaining full control over the eastern bank of the Uskar River line, and as well as establishing the front line along the Severodonetsk River line to the south of Liman. The objective of the Russians will be to gain full control over the northern bank of the Severodonetsk River line and the eastern bank of the Uskar River line, and to gain control over both Kupiansk and the Vorishna in the north, and Borova and Liman in the south. This is for the winter and spring. For the summer, it will be a siege of Sloviansk from the north and a push across the Uskar River line towards Izium in the west. This is to limit the final supply line in and out of the Donetsk region. Therefore, if we combine the northern section of the front line with the southern section of the front line, by the end of spring, towards June, we'll be looking at a front line along the Uskar River line, a beginning of the siege towards Izium, control over Liman, a siege towards Sloviansk from the north, control over Chasiv Yar, Konstantinivka, the highway between Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk itself, the entire southwestern parts of the Donetsk region. From that, we'll see that in the summer, the Russians start a push from Liman towards Sloviansk on the north, from Konstantinivka towards Droshkivka in the south, from Pokrovsk towards the western outskirts of the Donetsk region in the west, and this will lead to a 3-month-long siege of Kramatorsk, Droshkivka, Sloviansk, and the western outskirts of the Donetsk region for full control over Donetsk at the end of summer of 2025. Towards August, we'll likely see full control over the Donetsk region of the Russian forces. From there on, the Russians will look to push towards getting control of Izium and a push towards the Dnieper River from the Donetsk region in its entirety, towards the flank of Kharkiv, towards the flank of Zaporizhia, and the offensive operations of the Russians will significantly strengthen from there on. Therefore, the likely situation is that the Ukrainians will try to slow this process down as much as possible, potentially to delay it to winter of 2025 or spring of 2026 before this is achieved, and at the same time to expand the offensive capabilities surrounding the cities of Zaporizhia and Dnipro with defensive lines, expanding the defensive lines around the Donetsk region, around Izium, around the southern and eastern flank of Kharkiv, and significantly strengthening the defensive capabilities of their forces and positions, fortifications, and so on in the entirety of the Zaporizhia, Dnipro, and Kharkiv regions to contain the Russian advances to the Donetsk region. As for the Kharkiv region, the Kursk direction, the Sumy region, and the Chernihiv region, I'll leave that for a final video later on, again for this video to not be too long. And that is it for my analysis of the Kupiansk section of the front line and the Donetsk region, and the upcoming Russian offensive operations that will take place for the remainder of this winter season, the entirety of the spring season, and the entirety of the summer season. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.